this episode, we're going to take a very common problem in security work and make it feel manageable instead of overwhelming. When malware enters the picture, teams often feel like they have to do everything at once because malware sounds urgent by definition, and the fear of missing something can push people into frantic activity. The uncomfortable truth is that you rarely have unlimited time, unlimited staff, or perfect visibility, so doing everything is not an option even when the threat feels scary. What you can do, though, is choose the right tasks in the right order so that your limited effort creates the biggest possible defensive impact. By the end, you should have a simple mental model for sorting malware-driven work into actions that reduce real risk quickly, actions that preserve future options, and actions that are nice to have but can wait. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is to accept that malware-driven tasks are not all the same type of work, even if they arrive in the same stressful moment. Some tasks are about stopping harm that is already happening, like isolating a compromised system so it cannot keep spreading or leaking data. Some tasks are about understanding what happened, like collecting enough evidence to know where the intrusion started and how far it went. Other tasks are about preventing the same thing from succeeding again, like improving controls that allowed the malware to land in the first place. The mistake many beginners make is treating all these tasks as equally urgent, which leads to context switching, duplicated effort, and gaps where the attacker keeps operating. Prioritization begins when you separate tasks by purpose and decide which purpose matters most right now given what you know. Once you do that, you can allocate attention like a professional instead of reacting like a fire alarm. The first priority bucket is safety and containment, because preventing additional damage often beats perfect understanding in the early minutes. If a machine is actively communicating with suspicious infrastructure, executing new payloads, or trying to move laterally, then stopping that activity is usually the fastest way to reduce risk. In plain terms, you are trying to stop the bleeding before you start writing the detailed medical report. That does not mean you rip out the network cable without thinking, because careless actions can destroy evidence or trigger the attacker to change behavior. It means you choose containment actions that are proportional and reversible when possible, such as isolating a host at the network level while keeping it powered on for observation, or blocking known malicious destinations while you verify scope. The goal is to reduce the attacker's ability to do more harm while keeping your future investigation options open. The second priority bucket is scope and impact assessment, because you cannot make good decisions if you do not know what you are dealing with. Scope questions sound simple, but they have layers, and each layer can change your next move. You want to know which systems show signs of the same activity, which user accounts were involved, and whether the malware was a one-time hit or part of a larger intrusion. You also want to understand what the malware is trying to accomplish, because malware that steals credentials creates different urgency than malware that encrypts files, and both are different from malware that simply establishes quiet access. Impact is about what could be lost or disrupted, including sensitive data, core business functions, and trust. When you prioritize scope, you are basically buying clarity, and clarity is what turns panic into strategy. The third priority bucket is evidence preservation, and this one is easy to underestimate until you need it. Evidence is not only for law enforcement or blame, and it is not only for a formal report, because evidence helps you answer practical questions that directly affect defense. Without evidence, you may not know whether you have truly removed the attacker, whether the same access path remains open, or whether a second foothold exists. Preservation can be as simple as ensuring logs are retained, taking snapshots of volatile data when possible, and documenting what actions you took and when you took them. The order matters, because some evidence disappears quickly, especially evidence that lives in memory or in short-lived logs. If you isolate, collect key data, and document actions in a disciplined sequence, you keep the ability to learn from the event and to prove what happened when stakeholders ask. Evidence preservation is not about slowing down response. It is about preventing response from turning into guessing. To prioritize well, You need a way to estimate risk in a practical, beginner-friendly way that does not require complex math. Risk, for our purposes, is a blend of likelihood and impact, and malware changes both by increasing speed and uncertainty. Likelihood is influenced by whether the attacker still has access, whether the malware is spreading, and whether there are signs of persistence that will survive basic cleanup. Impact is influenced by what the affected systems do, what data they touch, and how expensive downtime would be. A workstation used for email and web browsing is not equal to a server that supports authentication, and neither is equal to a system that runs a critical business process. Prioritization means you put containment and investigation effort where the risk is highest, not where the alert is loudest. This is a subtle but powerful shift, because attackers love it when defenders chase noise instead of protecting high-value outcomes. One practical technique is to rank tasks based on how they change the attacker's options, because maximum impact often comes from reducing attacker freedom. If you block command and control, you might prevent new instructions, new payload delivery, and data exfiltration, which can collapse multiple attacker plans at once. If you reset a compromised credential without addressing how it was stolen, you might only create a brief inconvenience while the attacker steals it again. If you patch a vulnerable service that was exploited for initial access, you may close the door not only for this attacker, but for any future attacker trying the same method. Prioritization becomes clearer when you ask, which action removes the most attacker choices while creating the least new risk for us? Actions that cut off access, break persistence, and protect identity systems tend to have outsized impact, because identity is a common lever for scaling and intrusion. Another technique is to distinguish between tasks that are reversible and tasks that are irreversible, because irreversible actions deserve higher confidence. Reversible actions include network isolation, temporary blocks, and placing heightened monitoring, because you can adjust them as you learn more. Irreversible actions include wiping systems, rebuilding from scratch, or deleting files that may contain valuable evidence. That does not mean you never wipe, because sometimes you absolutely should, but it means you do not lead with destruction when uncertainty is high. You want to collect what you reasonably can first, then choose irreversible steps when the risk of leaving the system intact outweighs the benefit of additional evidence. This mindset also prevents a common beginner mistake, which is confusing motion with progress, where lots of aggressive activity creates the feeling of control but actually makes the incident harder to understand. Good prioritization is calm, deliberate, and aware of what cannot be undone. It is also important to prioritize communication tasks appropriately, because malware incidents are not purely technical events. Some communication is time-critical, like alerting a help desk that users may receive a suspicious email or warning an operations team that certain systems should not be rebooted yet. Other communication can wait, like a detailed narrative write-up, especially if it pulls key responders away from containment and scoping work. The impact of communication depends on who receives it and what decision it enables, so you should treat communication itself as a task with a purpose. If a leader needs to decide whether to take a service offline, you need to provide the minimum clear facts that support that choice, not a long technical lecture. If frontline defenders need to know what to look for, you give them observable behaviors and meaningful signals, not a list of confusing names. Prioritizing communication means aligning message depth and timing to the decision pressure of the moment. A related issue is that malware-driven work often includes tasks that feel satisfying but do not change outcomes much, and learning to delay those tasks is a major maturity leap. Deep reverse engineering of a binary can be valuable, but it may not be the best use of time if the malware's behavior is already clear enough to contain and eradicate. Searching endlessly for a perfect family label may not improve defense if you already know the initial access method and the affected accounts. Creating a beautiful timeline can wait if the attacker is still active and you have not yet blocked their access paths. These tasks are not bad. They are simply less urgent until the situation is stable. The key is to ask, will this task reduce harm or reduce uncertainty in a way that changes what we do next? Or does it merely satisfy curiosity? When you prioritize for maximum impact, curiosity becomes a tool, not a distraction. Once you have containment, scoping, and preservation in motion, The next high-impact tasks often involve closing the path that allowed the malware to arrive. This is where beginners sometimes struggle because the urge is to focus only on the malware sample itself. In reality, the malware is often the middle of the story, not the beginning, and if you do not address the beginning, you invite a repeat. If initial access came from a phish, you focus on identifying the lure pattern, the affected users, and the controls that failed to stop it. If initial access came from an exposed service, you focus on reducing exposure, improving authentication, and ensuring patching is aligned to actual internet-facing risk. If the intrusion leveraged weak credentials, you focus on identity hardening and account hygiene. These are high-impact tasks because they remove the entry door, not just the footprints inside the house. You also want to prioritize tasks that prevent lateral movement and privilege escalation, because those are the steps that turn a small incident into a major one. Malware often acts like a wedge that creates a foothold, and then the attacker uses that foothold to move toward more valuable systems. If you can slow or stop movement between systems, you can confine the problem and reduce blast radius. If you can reduce the ability to gain higher privileges, you make it harder for the attacker to disable defenses or access sensitive data. That is why tasks that protect core identity services, restrict administrative pathways, and enforce separation between user environments and critical servers have strong impact. Even at a high level, the lesson is that attackers scale damage by moving and escalating. So defenders scale safety by limiting movement and limiting privilege. Prioritization is where that principle becomes real action. All of this works best when you treat prioritization as a living process, not a one-time decision made at the beginning. As you gather more evidence, your risk picture changes, and your task order should change with it. If you discover that the malware was contained to a single system with no signs of credential theft, you may shift effort away from broad resets and toward focused remediation. If you discover signs of persistence across multiple systems, you may shift toward enterprise-wide containment and longer-term monitoring. If you discover that data was accessed, you may need to elevate notification and legal considerations, because the business impact changes even if the malware is removed. The strongest teams revise priorities without ego because they see adjustment as intelligence, not as admitting failure. When you build that habit early, you become someone who responds to reality instead of defending a plan. As we close, remember that prioritizing malware-driven tasks for maximum impact is really about choosing work that changes the outcome, not choosing work that looks impressive. High-impact tasks tend to reduce attacker options, reduce blast radius, and preserve your ability to learn what happened, while low-impact tasks often produce detail without changing risk. You start with containment that is thoughtful, move into scoping and impact assessment, preserve evidence so you can prove and improve, and then close the paths that made the intrusion possible. Along the way, you favor reversible steps when uncertainty is high, and you reserve irreversible steps for moments when the evidence supports them. If you keep returning to the questions of risk, attacker options, and decision value, you will consistently pick the next best action even when the situation is noisy. That is what maximum impact looks like in real defensive work, and it is a skill you can practice in every incident, even small ones.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.